Chapter 8. The End of My Story. Early one morning, while I was walking in my garden, I saw Daniel Peggotty opening the gate and coming towards me. He looked much older than before.
"David,"
he said happily,
"you've always been our friend, and I've come to tell you that I've found her."
"You found Emily?" I exclaimed. "But where and how?"
"I heard that she went to Italy with that evil man Steerforth. They lived there for some time,"
said Daniel.
"Then he became tired of her and left her. Poor Emily was alone and desperate, so she came back to London, and that's where I found her. I travelled all over Europe looking for her, and then one night I found her on a bridge here in London, looking down at the river. She's safe now."
"I'm very happy for you and Emily," I said, smiling at Daniel.
"Now, Emily and I want to go to Australia, a new country where nobody knows anything about her past. We can start a new life there."
"What a good idea!" I shouted. "When are you leaving?"
"We're leaving in about 6 weeks, but Ham and Peggotty want to stay in Yarmouth, where they know everyone,"
said Daniel. "I wish you and Emily lots of luck in your new life," I said.
"Thank you,"
he said, looking kindly at me. One day, I received a strange letter from Mr. Micawber in Canterbury, where he still worked for Uriah Heep. He said he wanted to meet with me and Traddles at the Wickfields' home. Dora was too ill to travel, so Traddles, Aunt Betsy, Mr. Dick and I went to Canterbury by coach. When we got to the Wickfields' home, Mr. Micawber took us to Uriah Heep's office. Uriah was surprised to see us, but said,
"I'm pleased to see you. Micawber, return to your desk now."
But Micawber didn't move. Agnes and Mrs. Heep came into the office too.
"Go back to your desk or you'll lose your job, Micawber,"
said Uriah angrily.
"Gentlemen,"
said Micawber,
"Uriah Heep is a terrible hypocrite. He's a dishonest man and a liar."
Uriah was shocked and shouted,
"I'm the master now. You must all leave this office."
Mr. Micawber looked at him angrily and said,
"I know all your secrets, Heep. Mr. Wickfield is afraid of you because you stole money from the business. Then you told him that he was responsible. Poor Mr. Wickfield believed you. You encouraged him to drink and you stole money from his clients. You took Miss Trotwood's money and said Mr. Wickfield was responsible. You're a thief."
"You don't know what you're saying, Micawber,"
cried Uriah furiously.
"I've never stolen anything in my life. Show me that what you say is true."
Mr. Micawber proudly took a small notebook out of his pocket and shouted,
"This is the proof."
He showed it to everyone and said,
"You tried to burn it, but I found it in the fireplace. All your secrets are in this little book."
Everyone in the room was shocked and looked at Uriah's pale face. Traddles said,
"Heep, you must give back all the money you've stolen and tell the truth. You must give us all your papers." "I'll never do it,"
cried Uriah desperately.
"Never."
Traddles looked at Uriah angrily and said,
"Perhaps you prefer to go to prison. Is that where you want to go? To prison?"
Uriah was silent for a moment. He was very embarrassed. Then he agreed to everything. Traddles examined the notebook and the false papers.
"You're just a liar, a thief, and a hypocrite, Uriah,"
cried Traddles.
"What shame!"
Aunt Betsy finally got her money back, and Mr. Wickfield wasn't afraid anymore. Agnes stood next to her father and smiled at him. My aunt was delighted and said,
Mr. Micawber, you're a brave man. You've just solved a very serious problem.
It was the only right thing to do,
said Mr. Micawber proudly.
Now I'll give you some money to go to Australia with your family. It's a new land with lots of opportunities,
said Aunt Betsy.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Micawber smiled at her husband and said,
I've always said that my husband was a great man, and he'll do great things in Australia. We can certainly start a new life there.
It was the end of Uriah Heep's evil power, and Agnes and her father were happy together once again. When I returned to London, my poor Dora was very ill. She stayed in her room all the time. One day she said,
You know, Dodie, I think I was too young and silly when we got married. I was never practical.
Don't say that, my dear, I whispered. We've been so happy together.
Yes, we've been very happy together, Dodie. Can you ask Agnes to come and visit me?
Of course, my love. I'll write to her immediately, I said. Agnes came the next day and went upstairs to see Dora. I knew Dora could not live long. The doctor told me she was seriously ill. I heard Agnes's voice from Dora's bedroom, and then there was silence. Agnes came downstairs and looked up. I knew Dora was dead, and after that day there was only great sadness in my life. In the middle of my sadness, I received a message from Emily. She wrote a letter to Ham before going to Australia and asked me to give it to him. I agreed to go to Yarmouth and give it to Ham. In the letter, she asked Ham to forgive her. As I was travelling, a terrible storm began with strong winds and heavy rain. In Yarmouth, many people were on the beach looking at the rough sea with its high waves. The sea was frightening. I decided to go down to the beach. There was a group of men looking out to sea. What's happening? I asked them.
It's an awful night, sir. 2 ships have gone down,
a man said.
We couldn't save anyone because the waves were too high.
Suddenly, a young man cried,
Look, there's another ship in trouble.
I could see a big ship that was in real danger. I saw several men on the ship, and one in particular was a good-looking young man who was shouting to the others. Then an enormous wave covered the ship, and it started to sink. It was terrible. Just then I saw Ham running on the beach towards the sea. One end of a rope was tied around his body, and the other end was held by 3 strong men on the beach.
Stop, Ham!
Cried his friends.
It's too dangerous! You'll kill yourself!
I must go and try to help those people.
Cried Ham. He jumped into the water and swam towards the ship. He was a strong swimmer, but he disappeared under a huge wave. The ship went down with a loud crash, and the men on the beach pulled on Ham's rope. He arrived on the beach, dead. After the storm, a young man was found dead on the beach. It was one of the ship's passengers, Steerforth. I couldn't believe my eyes. I lost 2 friends during one stormy night. I was too upset to return to London, so I left England and I travelled around Europe. One evening, when I was in Switzerland, I received a lovely letter from Agnes. I began to understand that I loved Agnes and that she was the perfect woman for me. After 3 years, I returned to England. My aunt, who was rich again, moved back to her home in Dover with Mr. Dick and Peggotty. In the meantime, Daniel, Emily and the Micawber family were living happily in Australia, and Mr. Micawber became an important man in the town. When I visited my aunt, I asked her, "How is Agnes? Is she married?" My aunt looked at me carefully and replied,
No, she's not. But I think she has a special person in her heart.
I didn't show my true feelings to my aunt, but I borrowed a fast horse and rode to Canterbury to see Agnes and her father. She was delighted to see me, and we talked for a long time. "Dear Agnes, you've always been so dear to me," I said. "My aunt says that you have a special person in your heart. Is that true?" Agnes turned away from me and said sadly,
If I have a secret, it isn't a new one. It's been a secret for a long time.
I was wild with hope. Was I her secret? "When I left England, Agnes, I loved you, and I still do," I said bravely. "You're the most important person in my life. Marry me." Agnes looked at me and said,
There's something I must tell you, David. I've always loved you too. And there's something else. Before our dear Dora died, she asked me to take her place and fill the empty space in your heart.
There was a moment of silence, and then Agnes said,
Yes, David, I'll be your wife.
Agnes put her head on my shoulder and cried, and I cried with her, because we were both so happy. After 20 years of marriage, Agnes and I live happily, surrounded by our wonderful children and our dear friends. And this is where my story ends.